The 89-year-old man entered a café and quietly asked for a sandwich. He was met with cold disdain and public humiliation, but a wealthy woman sitting nearby observed the scene closely. Her eyes caught sight of something on his wrist, and she suddenly froze. Heart pounding, she approached him, and when she saw what it was, her face went pale. The soft scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the bustling café, blending with the quiet murmur of conversations. It was just another regular afternoon, but an odd hush swept over the room when the door swung open, revealing an elderly man. He shuffled in, his steps slow and labored, as if every inch forward drained what little energy he had left. At 89, old Henry was a man whose weariness was etched into every line of his frail body. His thin, hunched frame bore not only the inevitable weight of age, but also the burden of a lifetime filled with hardship. His clothes, threadbare and worn, provided little protection against the biting chill that clung to the autumn air. His shoes, falling apart at the seams, exposed his toes to the cold. As he made his way through the café, his trembling hands and bent posture spoke volumes of his struggle. The indifferent glances from the patrons pierced him, and though the quiet chatter continued to Henry, it felt like the room was buzzing with harsh judgment. The gnawing ache in his empty stomach urged him forward, but each step was a battle between maintaining what little dignity he had left and the sheer desperation that drove him. He knew he was unwelcome, but there were no other options left. With a hesitant shuffle, Henry reached the counter where he placed a few coins down. Behind the counter stood Karen, the cafe's sharp-tongued owner. Her expression immediately hardened, and she eyed him with a horror. Her apron, stained from a day's work, reflected the mess of her attitude, one marred by prejudice. "Just the cheapest sandwich, please," Henry croaked, his voice barely rising above the low hum of the cafe. His fingers, twisted and dirty, struggled to lay out the few coins he had, though he tried to appear steady. Karen crossed her arms, her lips curling in contempt. "This isn't a charity, old man," she snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, making Henry flinch. "If you can't pay, you don't eat." Henry inhaled deeply, fighting to hold on to his composure as humiliation washed over him. "Please," he whispered, his voice thick with desperation, "just a little something. I'm starving." The words were soft, but the pain in his voice was unmistakable. His plea hung in the air, met with indifference. Around him, customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one moved to help. Karen leaned in closer, her voice dripping with venom. "Do you think you can come in here and beg for handouts? We don't give leftovers. Get out." A smirk from a nearby customer broke the tense silence. "Yeah, take a hike, old man," he muttered with a mocking grin. The room seemed to press in on Henry, suffocating him. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he was frozen, unable to decide whether to leave or beg a little harder. His stomach growled, and shame gripped him tight. He stood there, invisible to the world, feeling as if his entire life had been reduced to this humiliating moment. The oppressive silence only deepened his despair, making him want to disappear. Just when it seemed hope had abandoned him completely, the cafe door swung open once more. The sound drew everyone's attention as a woman strode in, her presence demanding the room's focus. Grace, with her perfectly styled chestnut hair and dressed in a tailored suit, moved through the cafe with an air of authority, her gaze immediately locked onto the scene unfolding at the counter. Without a moment's hesitation, Grace made her way toward Karen. The cafe's mood shifted at once. The arrogance that had clung to Karen vanished the instant she saw who had entered. Grace wasn't just any customer. She was a prominent figure in the city, known for her high-end boutiques and commanding reputation. "What's going on here?" Grace's voice was calm, but carried a weight of disapproval that made everyone sit up a little straighter. Grace's eyes were fixed on Henry, who remained frozen, struggling to hold on to what little pride he had left. Karen, shaken, tried to pull herself together, but Grace's sudden appearance had thrown the entire cafe into a hush. Everyone seemed to be waiting for what would happen next. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. With a warm, reassuring smile, Grace extended her hand towards Henry. "Don't worry, sir. Today's lunch is on me." Henry stared at her wide-eyed as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. His eyes, damp from tears of frustration, now shone with a flicker of hope. Grace then turned her gaze to Karen, who, caught off guard by this unexpected interruption, was trying hard to regain her footing and authority. The tension that had been brewing between Karen and Henry shifted its focus onto Grace, whose quiet but unmistakable strength filled the room. "I already told you. This man won't be served here," Karen repeated, her voice tight with frustration, desperately trying to control the situation. "This isn't a place for people like him." Grace remained calm, though the intensity in her eyes made Karen falter for a moment. "People like him," Grace repeated, leaning in slightly. "I think we're talking about a person, Karen, not some label." The cafe's other patrons, who had been quietly enjoying the humiliation of old Henry, now shifted uneasily in their seats, unsure of where to look. The scene had changed, and everyone felt it. Grace stood her ground, firm and unwavering, while Henry, who had kept his head down, looked up in quiet amazement at the woman standing up for him. His hands, trembling, still clutched the few coins he had scraped together. He wanted to say something, but shame choked the words in his throat. "I'll cover whatever he needs," Grace said, turning her attention back to Henry. "He has just as much right to be here as anyone else." Her eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to disagree. Karen, attempting to regain control, sneered, "We don't hand out charity here. If he can't pay, he doesn't belong. That's just business." "Business?" Grace interrupted, her voice still calm, but now tinged with a subtle irony. A small smile played on her lips. "Businesses are made up of people, Karen, and it seems you've forgotten that." She took a step closer to the counter, her voice rising just enough for the whole cafe to hear. "I've been coming here for years, and I never thought I'd witness something so heartless." A hush fell over the cafe. The whispers stopped, and all eyes were on Karen, who was clearly flustered. She knew Grace had a strong presence in the community, and clashing with her could hurt more than just her pride. But Karen, still clinging to her arrogance, crossed her arms as it could shield her from the rising tide of shame. "This isn't a soup kitchen," Karen said, standing firm. "If he doesn't have money, there's nothing I can do." Grace let out a soft laugh, though her gaze remained sharp as ever. "You're talking about charity, but you're missing the point. You're treating a human being like they're beneath you. Charity is optional. Humanity isn't." Henry, who had been quietly watching the back and forth, felt overwhelmed by the swirl of emotions inside him. It wasn't often, if ever, that someone spoke up for him like this, let alone someone like Grace. The humiliation he'd felt earlier was giving way to something else, an astonished gratitude. He could barely contain the tears that welled up in his eyes. Sensing how shaken he was, Grace softened her tone. "Don't worry, Don. Eat whatever you like today." She gently placed her hand over his, pushing the coins he had offered back towards him. "Keep these. You don't need to pay." Karen, her embarrassment now painfully obvious, fumbled for a way to end the confrontation, but it was too late. The moment belonged to Grace and Henry, and the cafe, once buzzing with indifference, now sat in silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. "All right, ma'am. If that's truly what you want, then so be it. But don't expect this to happen again," she muttered, her pride bruised but still intact. Grace, unfazed, offered a calm and gentle smile. "What won't happen again, Karen, is the way you treat people here, because I will ensure everyone knows how you run your business." Karen stiffened, realizing the gravity of her words. Meanwhile, the other patrons stayed quiet, unwilling to get directly involved, though it was clear they were now rethinking what they had just witnessed. Henry, still shaken but regaining a sense of dignity, was guided to a table by a hesitant server, all while under Grace's watchful gaze. She followed his every move, a strange mix of pity and satisfaction swelling inside her. There was something about this man that stirred a profound empathy within her, something she couldn't quite explain. As Henry settled into his seat, Grace approached and pulled up a chair beside him. "Now, sir, what can I get you? You're hungry, and that's what matters right now." Her voice, once firm and commanding, softened to something warmer and kinder. Henry, still unsure how to express his gratitude, stammered, "I don't know how to thank you, ma'am. What you've done for me." Grace shook her head gently, a tender smile playing on her lips. "No thanks necessary, Henry. Let's just start with a good meal, and then we can talk." Grace kept a close eye on the waiter, who, though reluctant, brought out Henry's plate. A sandwich and a hot cup of coffee were placed in front of him, the waiter avoiding eye contact but not daring to say a word under Grace's stern look. Henry gazed down at the food with a blend of disbelief and gratitude, his fingers trembling as he reached for the sandwich, pausing as if afraid the moment would vanish like a dream. "Go ahead, it's yours," Grace urged softly, her smile now kind, a far cry from the sharp edge it had carried earlier. "You deserve it." Henry nodded, his eyes glistening with unspoken thanks, and took a cautious bite. The act of eating seemed to melt away the shame and humiliation that had weighed so heavily on him moments before. He chewed slowly, almost reverently, as Grace quietly watched him, her heart grappling with a complex mix of compassion and something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite name, but that drew her closer to him. While Henry ate, the cafe attempted to return to a semblance of normalcy. Karen, still fuming over Grace's intervention, had retreated to the counter, muttering in hushed tones to her staff and casting sharp glances toward their table. Yet an unmistakable tension lingered in the air, as though everyone sensed that the scene wasn't quite over. It was then, as Grace adjusted her handbag on the table, that something on Henry's wrist caught her eye. A glint of light reflected off an old worn watch. At first she dismissed it, but a second glance made her pause. There was something eerily familiar about the shape and design. She blinked, trying to push aside the nagging feeling that an old memory was surfacing, one she wasn't ready to face. "Mr. Henry," she said, her voice now colored with curiosity. "May I see your watch?" Henry, slightly puzzled, glanced at his wrist as though he had forgotten he was even wearing it. "Oh, sure," he said, fumbling with the strap before handing it to her. It's a keepsake from someone important." Grace took the watch from him, her hands trembling as she felt the cool metal. A flood of long-buried memories rushed back. She turned the watch over, examining the back, and suddenly her heart raced. Etched into the underside, in the faintest of script, was a name that sent chills through her spine. Michael. Her hand flew to her mouth in disbelief. That watch. It was unmistakable. It was the very one she had given to the man who had meant the world to her all those years ago. That watch had belonged to Michael, the love of her life, the man she had lost in a cruel twist of fate. How had it ended up in Henry's hands? "Where did you get this?" Grace's voice quivered as she spoke, her gaze locked onto the watch, unable to look away. The sight of it was like tearing open a scar she had thought long since healed. Henry, noticing the distress in her eyes, hesitated for a moment. "It was a gift," he said cautiously, unsure of the weight his words carried. "A gift from my son, Michael." The name hit Grace like a freight train. Her suspicions had been confirmed. Henry's son was the very same Michael, the man she had loved so fiercely and mourned so deeply. Her heart raced, and a whirlwind of sorrow, shock, and aching nostalgia flooded her chest. Henry, still not fully grasping her reaction, continued softly, "Michael. He passed away many years ago. After that, nothing was ever the same." Grace could feel tears welling up, but she fought hard to keep them at bay. The revelation was too much, too sudden. Michael had vanished from her life without warning, leaving her with no chance for a final goodbye. And now, standing before her, was his father, a man weathered by grief, clutching the only piece of her past that still tied her to the man she'd lost. He was. Grace struggled to find her voice, the words choking in her throat. Henry, seeing the pain in her eyes, began to piece together the gravity of the moment. "You knew my son?" he asked, his voice tinged with both surprise and sorrow. Grace nodded, still unable to speak clearly. Her eyes met Henry's, filled with a bittersweet mix of affection and deep sadness. "I loved him," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I loved him more than anything." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotion. Henry stared at her, shocked as the weight of her confession sunk in. Grace, still clutching the watch tightly, held on as if it were her last remaining link to the past, afraid that, like Michael, it too might slip from her grasp. "Why didn't I ever know about you?" Henry finally asked, his voice heavy with a blend of curiosity and sorrow. Grace drew in a deep breath, steeling herself to reopen the old wounds she had long tried to forget. "It's a long story," she replied, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, Henry was no longer just a stranger in need. He was a link to Michael, a part of the story that had shaped her life. but I think it's time we talked." Grace cradled the watch as if it were something fragile, as though the weight of her memories might shatter it at any moment. Every detail of the object pulled her back into the past. The worn gleam, the delicate inscription underneath, and the way Michael would absent-mindedly twist it around his wrist as they talked. It was all coming back now, rushing over her like a wave, dragging her into the memories she thought she had buried forever. Henry watched her in silence, his own eyes growing misty as understanding began to dawn. He knew that look, the look of someone who had loved his son as deeply as he had, someone who shared the same unbearable loss. The connection between them was undeniable. "He never mentioned you," Henry said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. He seemed conflicted, unsure whether he was ready to hear what Grace had to say, but also knowing that he needed to understand. Grace sighed deeply, still holding the watch gently between her fingers. The past was not done with her yet. "I don't even know where to start," she said, her voice weighed down by sorrow, memories flooding her heart. "I met Michael when we were still young. I had just gotten my first job at a small boutique in the city. He would stop by often, dropping off donations for the orphanage where I was raised. That's how we grew close." Henry's eyes widened. "An orphanage," he repeated, his voice full of surprise. Grace nodded, her gaze drifting far away as memories clouded her eyes. "Yes, I grew up there from the time I was a little girl. I never had the chance to know my parents, but the orphanage became my home. It's where I met Michael. He was always so kind, so full of energy and passion. We had all these dreams for the future, plans we had made together, until everything changed." Her voice grew softer, tinged with a sadness that had lingered for years. Henry was silent, absorbing every word she said. Her pain mirrored his own. But now, hearing her story, he realized there was a part of Michael's life he had never known, a side of his son he'd lost before he could even begin to understand it. His heart ached with longing, but also with a bittersweet gratitude for finding someone who had shared that love for his son. "I never knew about that part of his life," Henry murmured, his head lowering under the weight of the revelation. "After Michael passed, my wife Eleanor always needed someone to blame. She would say he pulled away from us because of a woman, but she never shared the details. All I knew was that after his death, nothing was the same." At the mention of Eleanor, Grace's body tensed. She didn't need any further explanation to know exactly who Henry meant. The memories of her brief encounters with Eleanor, cold, distant, and brimming with disapproval, flashed through her mind. Eleanor had never accepted her. Grace's voice trembled. "She never thought I was good enough for him," she said quietly, her words heavy with old wounds. That created a divide between Michael and his family. He was torn apart, trying to please everyone, being the perfect son while wanting to live his own life. It was a really hard time. Henry's eyes softened with understanding. He had never realized just how heavy a burden his son had carried. He had only ever seen Eleanor's side, her belief that the woman Michael loved was to blame. But sitting across from Grace now, he began to understand that the pain, the conflict had been far more profound than he had imagined. "He kept visiting me, but—" Grace's voice trailed off. "It wasn't often," Henry finished for her, sighing deeply, exhaustion in his voice. "And then—" Grace's breath hitched as the conversation neared the moment she had feared, the point where everything had unraveled. Henry's voice grew weaker, strained with the weight of years of unresolved grief. "That day, it happened so fast. Michael was with you, and I never really knew what happened. He was gone, and all I had left was this." His eyes fixed on the watch in Grace's hands, the last physical reminder of the son he had lost. Grace's eyes closed for a moment, her tears threatening to spill over. She had been there that day, the day of the accident, the day everything changed. "I was with him," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she finally broke her silence. "We were on our way to a friend's house, but we never made it. The car, it all happened so fast. When I woke up, he was already gone." She couldn't hold it back any longer. Tears streamed down her face as she buried her hands in them, surrendering to the weight of the grief she had carried for so long. Henry watched her, his own tears tracing the deep lines of his weathered face, unable to keep the flood of emotion at bay. "I never knew," he whispered, his voice breaking under the strain of his regret. "I never knew you were with him." Grace shook her head, trying to regain control over her emotions. But the pain of that memory was as sharp now as it had been all those years ago. I loved him with every part of my being, she confessed softly, and in a single moment, I lost everything. She had tried to move forward, but the shadows of her past clung to her, while Henry had sunk deeper into despair, regret consuming him. Until now, what stood before her was a broken, weary man, merely existing in the wreckage of his losses. I still can't believe it, Henry whispered, shaking his head slowly, his voice thick with disbelief. You were the woman he loved. I never understood what that truly meant to him, he murmured. Grace quickly brushed away her tears, trying to hold on to the last shred of composure. I didn't even realize he was your son until today. But when I saw the watch, all the memories came flooding back. He never took it off, she said, her voice breaking. I gave it to him when we first started dreaming about the future together. She glanced at Henry, his eyes distant, lost in a time long gone. He rarely spoke of you, Henry continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But I knew something. Something was pulling him away from us. Eleanor, my wife, she never approved of him being with someone outside of our world. She had grand plans, wanted him to marry someone from high society, someone who would raise our family status. His voice trembled under the weight of old wounds. Grace nodded, feeling the sting of those words. She despised me. Every time I tried to get close, I could feel her contempt, and Michael. He was torn, always trying to please everyone. Her voice softened. He was a good man, Henry. He just wanted to make everyone happy, but in doing so, he lost himself. Henry took a slow, shaky breath, his hands trembling ever so slightly as they rested on the table. I never thought it would end like this after he was gone. Eleanor and I drifted apart. She carried so much guilt, and deep down, I think she blamed me too. That's when everything began to fall apart. Grace looked at him, her heart aching with understanding. How did you end up here? She asked quietly, careful not to tread too harshly on his wounds. Henry exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his story was pulling him further into himself. When Michael died, Eleanor, she was never the same. Grief swallowed her whole, and I lost myself too. Our marriage couldn't survive it. The guilt, the grief, it all became too much, and I distanced myself from everything. We had a life that others would have envied, but after losing him, it all felt meaningless. Henry's voice cracked as he continued. Eleanor always blamed me. She said if I had been stricter, firmer with Michael, he would have made different choices, stayed away from you. And for a long time, in my weakness, I believed she was right. Grace felt a heavy pang in her chest hearing that. It hurt to know that Eleanor had seen her as the reason their family had unraveled. She reached across the table, her voice gentle. Henry, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. Life. Sometimes it takes us places we never expect, and no one could have predicted what happened. It was an accident. But the love Michael had for you, for me, that love was real, and no amount of blame can erase that. Tears welled in Henry's eyes as he gazed at her, visibly moved by her words. I never thought I'd meet you, the woman my son loved with all his heart. This moment, it means more to me than I can express. Grace placed her hand lightly on his, her touch soft but full of shared grief. We've both lost so much, and somehow, through all the pain, we've found each other here. I don't know why fate has brought us together now, but maybe it means something. For a moment they sat in silence, letting the weight of their revelations and the emotions that followed settle between them. They were two people bound by loss, yet somehow, in that shared heartache, a new understanding bloomed. Michael's watch still rested in Grace's hands before she gently returned it to Henry. With a somber expression, he fastened it back onto his wrist. This watch, Grace whispered, her voice tender, isn't just a piece of jewelry. It represents the time we shared with him, the moments, the memories. And though it brings pain, it also reminds me that life keeps moving, and somehow we have to find a way to keep going. Henry gave her a sad, knowing smile, deeply touched by the truth in her words. I don't know how to move forward, he confessed softly. After we lost everything, Eleanor and we ended up homeless. Now we're just scraping by. A wave of deep empathy washed over Grace, making her shift uncomfortably in her seat. And where is Eleanor now? She asked, her voice tinged with concern. Henry looked down. She's waiting for me in the square nearby. We've got nowhere else to go, and honestly, she's in worse shape than I am." Grace inhaled deeply, sensing the weight of the situation and the need to act. "I want to meet Eleanor," she said firmly. "I want to help you both. I can't change the past, but maybe I can do something to make the future better." As Grace walked beside Henry through the lively city streets, her mind replayed their conversation in the café. The father of the man she once loved was now by her side, leading her toward a woman who had always harbored disdain for her. Grace braced herself for the emotional challenge that lay ahead. Henry moved slowly, his steps heavy with the burdens of the past, while Grace's heart raced with a mix of apprehension and determination. Her thoughts whirled as her eyes drifted over the city, though she was lost in the memories of Michael's mother. Reuniting with Eleanor felt unreal, a meeting she had never thought would happen. The idea of facing this woman filled her with anxiety, but she knew it was necessary. After several minutes of silent walking, they arrived at a small, forgotten square nestled between old, weathered buildings. The place had a quiet, worn charm, with a few people sitting on benches or wandering slowly. Under the shade of a large tree, they spotted her. Eleanor sat there, and the sight of her was startling. The once formidable woman, who had always carried herself with grace and authority, was now a frail shadow of her former self. Hunched over in a shabby worn coat, her gray hair was tied back carelessly, her eyes dull and vacant as she clutched a small bag by her side. Henry approached cautiously, as if he might disturb something fragile or breakable. Grace followed closely behind, her pulse quickening, anxiety building in her chest. As they neared, Eleanor slowly lifted her gaze, her expression shifted from exhaustion to guarded suspicion at the sight of a stranger with her husband. "Henry," she croaked, her voice raspy and weak. Who is this?" Henry paused, fumbling for the right words. "Eleanor, this is Grace?" She meant a lot to Michael. The name Michael fell into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of tension through the air. Eleanor's eyes widened at the sound of the name, and in that moment she knew exactly who stood before her. "Grace?" Eleanor's voice trembled, a mixture of disbelief and fury coloring her words. You're the one who tore him from us, the reason behind all this suffering." The accusation struck like a sharp blade, and though the weight of Eleanor's words hit hard, Grace steadied herself with a deep breath, determined not to react. If there was any hope of mending what had been broken, patience was essential. "Eleanor, I understand why you see me that way," Grace replied, her voice soft but resolute. "But I'm here to help. We can't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, we can figure out a way to move forward." Eleanor shook her head slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag tightly. "You don't get it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I lost everything, my sons, our life. None of it makes sense anymore." The pain in Eleanor's eyes was palpable, and Grace felt a tightness in her own chest. This woman had been completely shattered by Michael's death, and there was no denying the depths of her grief. Kneeling beside her, Henry gently took Eleanor's hands into his own. "My love, I know you've been through hell. I have too. But today we found Grace by chance, and she wants to help us. Maybe it's time we stopped running from the past." Eleanor's gaze flickered from Henry to Grace, her confusion evident, mixed with the deep scars of her pain. "Why now?" she asked, narrowing her eyes as if searching for a hidden agenda. "Why, after all we've lost, would you suddenly want to help us? You don't owe us anything." Grace moved closer, kneeling beside Henry so she could look Eleanor in the eye. Her gaze was full of compassion, her words laced with a deep, quiet emotion. "I loved Michael," she said softly. "We've all lost so much. But I'm here now, trying to do what I think he would have wanted. He taught me forgiveness, how to care for others, and I believe that wherever he is now, he'd want me to reach out to you." For a long moment, there was only silence between them, the rustling leaves in the wind, the only sound in the quiet square. Grace could see the battle within Eleanor, years of anger and grief, wrestling with the fragile hope of letting go. Finally, Eleanor let out a long, weary sigh, as though releasing a burden she'd carried for years. "I don't know what to say." Henry gently squeezed her hands. "Just say you'll let us try, Eleanor. We've been stuck in this pain for so long. Maybe it's time to let it go." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, a bit of the tension in her body softened. "I don't know if I can. Trust again," she whispered. Grace offered a kind, understanding smile. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away, but let me help. We'll take it one day at a time. I have room at my place. You can stay with me until we figure out a better plan." Eleanor glanced at Henry, his eyes filled with tenderness and hope. After a brief pause, she nodded, letting the tears finally fall. "I accept." A small smile spread across Grace's face. In that moment, she felt a shift in the air between them. It wouldn't be an easy journey, and the path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it felt like they were all moving toward something better, toward healing. The first rays of dawn streamed through the windows of Grace's house, casting a warm light across the cozy living room. Henry and Eleanor had settled in the night before, still tentative and unsure of the drastic change in their lives. Grace's home was a stark contrast to the cold, hard reality Henry and Eleanor had endured. It was modern yet welcoming, with carefully chosen furniture that reflected Grace's successful life. Sitting in an armchair by the large window, Grace cradled a steaming mug of coffee, watching the sunrise. Her thoughts were tangled, the events of the previous day playing over in her mind like an unfinished story. The presence of Henry and Eleanor in Grace's home was more than just an act of kindness. It was a gesture aimed at mending old wounds, an offering of forgiveness, and perhaps a search for peace. When Eleanor appeared at the door, there was a hesitance about her, still trying to come to terms with being in Grace's house. Seeing her now, a woman who had once been so proud and fierce, was disarming. Time had worn her down, her shoulders slumped under the weight of years filled with grief. Her eyes, though weary, carried a flicker of something new. Maybe it was hope. "You're up early," Grace remarked softly, motioning to the couch beside her. "Would you like some coffee?" Eleanor hesitated, as if unsure whether to accept the gesture, but then slowly made her way to the couch. "Yes, I'd like that. Thank you." Grace poured a steaming cup and handed it over, and Eleanor clasped it tightly, letting the warmth thaw her cold fingers. The silence between them was thick, but not filled with animosity. "I still can't believe I'm here," Eleanor muttered, her gaze fixed on the cup. "If someone had told me years ago that I would one day accept your help, I would have laughed in their face." Grace gave a knowing smile. "I understand," she said quietly. "To be honest, I never thought we'd end up here, together, after everything that's happened." Eleanor inhaled deeply, as though bracing herself for a difficult truth. "I never liked you, Grace. From the moment Michael mentioned you, I knew you weren't what I wanted for him. I wanted someone who could help him achieve more in life." Grace remained silent, letting Eleanor speak at her own pace. But now Eleanor's voice quivered. "Now I see how wrong I was. I lost my son, I lost my life. And for so long I blamed you. I thought you were the reason for everything that went wrong. But in reality, what happened was far beyond our control." Grace felt her throat tighten. This was a confession she had never expected. "I never meant to take him from you," she whispered, her voice laced with emotion. "I loved Michael, but I know he loved you both too. It was never an easy decision for him to pull away. He always wanted to make everyone happy." Tears began to well up in Eleanor's eyes. "I was blinded by pain and pride. I let resentment take root, and it destroyed me, destroyed us all. When Michael left, I lost my way, and for years I blamed you. But now I see, you weren't to blame. I just didn't know how to deal with the loss." Grace's own tears surfaced, the weight of Eleanor's words breaking down the emotional wall she had long built up. "We both lost," she said, her voice heavy. "I lost the love of my life, and you lost your son. We've both suffered, just in different ways, but neither of us escaped this unscathed." Eleanor quickly wiped her tears, trying to preserve what little dignity she had left. "I don't even know how to thank you for helping us now, after everything I've put you through." Grace looked at her, her expression soft with understanding. "I don't need thanks, Eleanor. What I want is for all of us to find some peace. Guilt and resentment have eaten at us for too long. It's time to let it go, for Michael's sake, if not for our own." A small, tentative smile crept across Eleanor's face. "He'd be happy to see this, wouldn't he?" Grace nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Yes, he would." At that moment, Henry entered the room, interrupting the delicate conversation but bringing with him a different kind of energy. He seemed calmer, as though just having a roof over his head and a comfortable bed to sleep in had breathed new life into him. "You two are having a talk?" he asked, a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good sign." Eleanor and Grace exchanged glances and let out quiet laughs. Henry sighed with visible relief and sat down beside Eleanor, gently taking her hand in his. "I always knew we weren't really living," he admitted. "After we lost everything, the pain consumed us. But maybe now we have a shot at something new." Grace looked at the couple, her heart swelling with hope. "You can stay here as long as you need, but I hope in time we'll find something more permanent for you. You both deserve a fresh start." Eleanor squeezed Henry's hand, a shy smile touching her lips. "Thank you, Grace. Maybe this is our chance to finally let Michael rest in peace." The days passed quickly after that moment of reconciliation, and Henry and Eleanor began to settle into life at Grace's house. The air, once thick with unspoken sorrow, gradually lightened, filling with a peace they hadn't known for years. Grace devoted herself to giving them not just shelter, but also a renewed outlook on life. Their transformation didn't happen overnight, but slowly the warmth and compassion surrounding them started to heal their deepest scars. One afternoon, while Grace was sorting through papers in the living room, Henry walked in slowly and sat beside her. His gaze was distant, but a quiet determination shone in his eyes. "Grace," he began thoughtfully, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I don't want you to feel like we're overstaying our welcome." He paused for a moment, glancing at her before continuing. "Eleanor and I have been here for a while now, and I'm deeply thankful for all you've done for us. But I think it's time for us to find something more permanent." Grace looked at him, surprised but also admiring his resolve. "Henry, you're not overstaying. I'm helping you because I want to, and because in a way it's helping me too. But I understand. You need something that's yours, don't you?" Henry nodded, a slow smile forming. "Exactly. It's time we start building something for ourselves again, even if it's small, something we can truly call home." Grace smiled warmly, moved by his honesty. "That's wonderful, Henry. And you don't have to do it alone. I still want to help, but now in a different way. We can look together for a place that's comfortable, somewhere you both can start over with dignity." Henry was visibly touched by her words, his voice faltering. "I don't know how to thank you enough for all this. After so long on the streets, I didn't think I'd ever get the chance to live a normal life again." "You deserve this new beginning," Grace replied gently. "And so does Eleanor. I'm so glad you're ready for this next step." Just then, Eleanor walked into the room, curiosity in her eyes. Seeing their serious expressions, she approached, hesitating slightly. "Are you two talking about leaving?" she asked, glancing between Henry and Grace. "Yes," Grace said, her smile encouraging. "Henry mentioned that you're ready to find a place of your own. I think it's a great idea. How do you feel about it?" Eleanor exhaled, her voice uncertain but honest. I'm not sure," she admitted. "I feel safe here after everything we've been through. The idea of leaving again, it scares me." Grace stepped forward, gently taking Eleanor's hands in her own. "I understand," she said softly. "No one's saying it has to happen right away. We'll do this at your pace whenever you feel ready. The important thing is that you know you'll always have a home, no matter where you are, and I'll always be here to help." Eleanor turned to Henry, who was looking at her with quiet encouragement, as if saying it was finally time for them to move forward. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising as she slowly nodded. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was finally time to begin again. "But if I do this, I need to know we're not doing it alone." "You'll never be alone," Grace reassured her with quiet certainty. "This is a journey we'll walk together." In the days that followed, Grace devoted herself to helping the couple find their new home. They sifted through real estate listings, wandered through various neighborhoods, and after a few weeks, they found it. A small, modest house with a warm, welcoming feel. It sat nestled in a peaceful suburb, just a stone's throw from a quiet park where Henry and Eleanor could take walks and rediscover a sense of normalcy. When the house was chosen, Grace jumped in to help with the move, ensuring everything was ready to make the place feel like a real home. Their first night there was charged with excitement. Henry and Eleanor, though still a bit uneasy, felt a sense of joy, knowing they could finally call this house their own. The cozy living room, with its simple furnishings and soft golden light, became a symbol of fresh beginnings. As the night drew to a close, Grace stood on the front steps of their new home, saying her goodbyes. Henry pulled her into a warm embrace, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given us something we can never repay, Grace. The chance to be a family again." Grace smiled, clearly touched. "You don't owe me anything. Just live this new life with all the love and gratitude you have. That's more than enough." Eleanor, who had once struggled to express her emotions, stepped forward and hugged Grace tightly. "I never thought I could forgive, let alone move on. But now I see that forgiveness frees us. I'm so grateful for this second chance." "We are all healing together," Grace said softly, looking at both of them with affection. "Michael would be proud to see this." As Grace walked away, leaving Henry and Eleanor standing together on the threshold of their new home, a weight lifted from her heart. The past had been full of pain, but now there was finally a path to peace. Weeks passed, and Henry and Eleanor slowly adjusted to their new life. Their routine in the small house was simple, but it brought a calm they hadn't felt in years. The daily walks in the park, the quiet conversations over dinner, and even the shared silences offered a kind of healing balm for their weary souls. Grace continued to visit often, always making sure they had everything they needed. What had begun as brief, formal visits soon became long afternoons filled with laughter, shared stories, and hopeful discussions about the future. Grace hadn't just helped them find a physical home, she had given them the emotional space to heal, where forgiveness and love could finally take root. One bright Sunday afternoon, Grace decided to do something special. She invited Henry and Eleanor to spend the day at her house, planning a surprise that she hoped would deepen the bond they had formed. When they arrived, they were greeted by Grace's warm smile and the inviting scent of a home-cooked meal. The house was filled with sunlight streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow over everything. It felt like a day of renewal. "You picked the perfect day to visit," Grace said, guiding them into the dining room. "I have a surprise for you." Henry and Eleanor exchanged curious looks, certain that whatever Grace had planned would be meaningful. They took their seats at the table, admiring the simple elegance of the decor and the thoughtful arrangement of dishes. Before they could ask about the surprise, the living room door opened, and a tall, smiling young man entered. Grace stood up, her eyes bright with pride as she walked toward him. "Henry, Eleanor, I want you to meet Liam," Grace said, her voice filled with emotion. "He's my son. He had just returned from college, filled with excitement to see you again." Eleanor's face brightened instantly while Henry's eyes twinkled with true joy. As Liam approached the table, he reached out to greet them. "It's wonderful to meet you," he said with a warm smile, shaking Henry's hand and offering Eleanor a gentle hug. She welcomed him with a soft, loving gaze. "You look so much like your mother," Henry remarked with a light chuckle, "and it's obvious she raised you right." Grace stood nearby, her heart swelling with gratitude as she watched the moment unfold. This wasn't just an ordinary family reunion. It marked the start of something new. A deeper connection in the circle of love and forgiveness Grace had worked so hard to build. In many ways, Liam's presence represented the continuation of Michael's legacy. Michael never got the chance to meet their son, but now Henry and Eleanor were meeting Grace's son, a living part of her future. As they shared lunch, conversation flowed effortlessly with no awkward pauses. Henry and Eleanor, who had once been weighed down by years of grief, now appeared lighter, almost rejuvenated. After the meal, Grace suggested they all move to the garden for coffee. Liam, ever thoughtful, helped Henry make his way to the patio, while Eleanor and Grace strolled behind them, chatting warmly about the blooming flowers lining the path. Sitting outside as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the atmosphere was one of complete tranquility. Grace glanced around, feeling for a moment that everything was finally falling into place. "I never imagined I could feel this again," Eleanor said, breaking the peaceful silence. "This sense of family, of belonging, I thought that died with Michael." Grace gently took her hand. "We're rebuilding it together, Eleanor. We have a chance to make new memories and live more freely." Henry, who had been gazing at the sunset, spoke quietly. "You know, Michael left us far more than we realized. Even though he's gone, he continues to bring us together. I can feel him here somehow, witnessing the peace we've found." Liam, who had been listening closely, leaned forward and spoke with calm assurance. "A person's legacy never truly fades. Michael was a huge part of your lives, but now you are all part of my story, too. And that makes me incredibly happy." Eleanor smiled, a single tear slipping down her cheek, this time not one of sorrow. "You're a kind soul, Liam. I think in some way we're all connected by something bigger than ourselves." The rest of the afternoon was filled with heartfelt conversations, shared laughter, and a quiet sense of reconciliation that lingered in the air. As the evening settled in, Grace walked them back to their new home, where Henry and Eleanor said their goodbyes with warm, lingering hugs, promising this was just the beginning of many more gatherings to come. Walking home with Liam by her side, Grace felt as though the long cycle of grief and loss was finally closing. The past would always be a part of them, but now, for the first time, the future seemed full of hope. After months of pain and healing, Grace, Henry, Eleanor, and Liam had at last found the peace and love they had long been searching for. Each of them, marked by the trials of their past, had learned to forgive, to let go, and to move forward, bonded by ties deeper than blood. And Grace, who had borne the heavy burden of losing Michael, now carried only gratitude and a deep sense of peace. Henry and Eleanor, once burdened by sorrow, found solace in the beauty of a simpler life and the strength of shared love. Liam, with his youthful spirit and boundless generosity, became a beacon of hope, weaving a sense of renewal within his family. In time, they became a new family, reborn through forgiveness and a deep sense of unity. Together, they created a home that overflowed with love and optimism, ready to embrace the future with resilience, no longer chained to the wounds of their past. Love and forgiveness became their guiding light, leading them to a fresh beginning, filled with hope and endless possibilities. Make sure to hit the notification bell, share this story with friends, and check out the video on the screen. You won't want to miss what comes next.